Anybody who's had to kasher their home for Pesach will know what an incredible chore it is to clean everything, to scrub everything, to make sure that the pans and the pots and all of the cutlery that was used during the year can now be used for Pesach through a process known as hagalat kelim, purging of vessels, to put them through boiling water, perhaps to burn out the stove. There are so many different aspects of what today we refer to as kashering utensils. Where do these laws come from? And actually they are in this week's parasha. The Jewish people go out to war against Midian. There's quite a small force, and it's really a war of revenge because of the way that the Midianites treated them, that they came into the nation and they caused many of the men to become promiscuous and ultimately to worship their idol, which was known as Baal Peor. And the soldiers come back victorious, and they have spoils of war. And many of these spoils of war are cooking utensils, pots and pans and cutlery and that's like. And they don't know what to do with all of these things. So the Torah tells us that Eleazar HaKohen, Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron, the first Kohen Gadol, who was now the Kohen Gadol in place of his father, he came forward and he taught them these laws of Hagalat Kelim, of how to kosher utensils, to make sure that they were could be used in a kosher kitchen. The question is, why did Eleazar HaKohen teach them these laws? Why was it not Moshe Rabbeinu? Why was it not Moses who taught them these laws, as he had taught the Jewish people every other law? And here our sages led us in on an incredible idea. When the soldiers came back from battle, they brought loot, they brought booty and spoils. They also brought back human prisoners. And some of those human prisoners were the very same women who had been involved in promiscuous acts with the Jewish men, and that had led to a terrible plague. And when Moshe saw the soldiers coming back with these captives, it says, "Vayiksof Moshe al pekudei chayil." He became angry. He became furious with them. And he said, how could you bring back these very same captives? They got us into all of this trouble in the first place. And as soon as he became angry, says the Talmud, "Nit'alma mimenu halacha." He forgot the law. He forgot the law that he had learned from God at Sinai about how to kasher utensils. He couldn't teach it. And therefore, he designated and he deputized Eleazar HaKohen to teach them the laws. And hence our sages tell us that there are terrible circumstances, there are terrible and dire consequences to becoming angry. In the case of a prophet, when a prophet becomes angry, he loses his prophecy. As we see in the case of Elisha. When Elisha the prophet saw a wicked man, he became angry and he lost his prophecy until he was able to be calmed down. In the case of Moshe, a wise man, when a wise man becomes angry, he loses his wisdom. He wasn't able to teach them these laws. He forgot himself. And the Talmud goes a step further. And it says, Kola korea begadav, ksuto bekas. Whoever rips up his clothing in anger or smashes plates, eventually that person will worship idolatry. Now, what's the connection? What does that mean? That if a person tears his clothing in anger, he'll eventually worship idolatry? That's quite a disconnect. Those two things are not exactly connected. Well, the one interpretation which seems to be favored by the Talmud is as follows. It doesn't mean that he's worshiping idolatry now, but ultimately he will worship idolatry. Because this is the way of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. First, it gets you to do something minor. And once it has you in its grasp, things become worse and worse and worse. As our sages say, Avon goreret avon, aveira goreret aveira. One sin leads to another. It begins small, and then it gets bigger and bigger. To begin with, you're tearing your clothes. Then you become angry, and then you do something else. And you lose your mind entirely until eventually you are worshipping idols, one of the three cardinal sins. But another explanation that I've heard often mentioned by contemporary rabbis, that when the Talmud says that when you become angry, it's as if you are serving idolatry. Who is the idol? What is the idol that you're serving? You're serving yourself. You're giving into your own ego, your own desires, your own lusts. And that ultimately is serving yourself, making an idolatry out of yourself, and not keeping in mind the circumstances around you. Are they really appropriate to become angry? Should you act angry? Or should perhaps you first calm down, go to the corner, think about it, and then react with a rational mind? And that's ultimately what a person should do. It's very interesting that the Rambam Maimonides, when discussing the terrible sin of Moses, when Moses hit the rock, and because of this he was not allowed entry into the land of Israel, the Rambam says something which is in a way simple but also very profound. He says that the sin of Moshe Rabbeinu was that he became angry, and that it was inappropriate for the leader of all of the prophets, Adon HaNevi'im, the master of all of the prophets, to become angry when he was leading the Jewish people. Anger is a terrible thing. Now, that doesn't mean that we should become totally passive and not be affected by anything whatsoever. We're allowed to have, if you like, an internal anger, but then we have to calm down. We have to think before we act, because when we act and we are angry, we lose our minds entirely, and there can be terrible consequences. And so the laws of Hechsher Kalim, of purging vessels, was taught not by Moshe, as it should have been, but by his nephew Eleazar Kohen, to teach us that when great people become angry, they lose their learning. And therefore, this is something that we should try to work within ourselves, to understand that, yes, we can become angry, but before we react, calm down, think clearly, and do something correct before you regret the consequences of your actions. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.